She walked into that ballroom alone. No ring on her finger, no armor on her skin, just 10 years of silence and a dress that fit every curve they once mocked. They saw a woman who never belonged. They smiled like wolves. What they didn't know, what nobody in that glittering, poison-filled room could have known, was that outside, idling in the dark, was a convoy of black SUVs carrying the most dangerous man in the city, a man who called her wife. If you've ever been underestimated, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a water bill and a catalog for garden furniture Nia had never ordered. She almost threw it away without opening it. Almost. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind people chose when they wanted to signal importance without saying it outright. Her name was printed in gold italic across the front. Nia Brooks. Her maiden name. The name she hadn't used in 3 years, the name that belonged to a version of herself she had driven 1,200 miles and a whole lifetime to escape. She stood in the kitchen of her brownstone, the morning light cutting through the blinds in thin yellow strips, and she held that envelope for a long time before she tore it open. Westbrook Academy Class Reunion, 10-year anniversary. You are cordially invited to an evening of celebration, connection, and reflection. Nia read it twice. Then she set it on the counter, poured herself a cup of coffee she didn't taste, and stood there staring at the wall until the coffee went cold. Westbrook Academy. Those 2 words had a physical weight. She felt them settle somewhere behind her sternum. Not pain exactly, more like the ghost of pain. The muscle memory of something that had healed wrong. She was 34 years old. She ran a successful interior design consultancy from a home office that looked out over a courtyard full of climbing jasmine. She had a husband who left her handwritten notes on the bathroom mirror. She had a life, a real one, the kind that people spent decades trying to build. And still, 2 words on a piece of expensive paper could make her palms sweat. That was the part she hated most. Not the invitation itself. The fact that it still had the power to do anything to her at all. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Unhurried, deliberate. Lucien never moved quickly unless there was a reason to. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in dark trousers and a white dress shirt, collar open, sleeves not yet rolled down. He was the kind of man who looked put together even before he was finished putting himself together. Dark hair, a jaw that could have been carved from something expensive, eyes that had seen too much, and kept all of it behind a very controlled expression. He noticed the envelope immediately. He noticed everything immediately. It was one of the things about him that could make ordinary people deeply uncomfortable. What's that? Nothing. She picked up her coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. Reunion invitation. He crossed the kitchen and picked up the invitation before she could stop him. Not that she tried very hard to stop him. He read it with the same calm attention he gave everything, his face giving away nothing. Westbrook Academy, he said. Yeah. The same school. She didn't answer. He knew. She had told him enough, over enough nights, in enough pieces that she'd never meant to share, for him to know exactly what Westbrook Academy meant. He hadn't pushed for the details. He'd just listened, in that very still way he had, and absorbed it. You don't have to go, he said, setting the invitation back on the counter. I know. But you're thinking about it. She looked at him. He was already looking at her, and there was nothing accusatory in his expression, no judgment, just that watchful attentiveness that was uniquely his. I'm thinking about it, she admitted. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Why? He asked. Not unkindly, he genuinely wanted to understand. Nia thought about that for longer than the question probably warranted. She picked up the invitation again and looked at her name, Nia Brooks, in that gold italic script that felt both familiar and foreign. Because I spent 10 years running away from something, she said finally, and I'm tired of running. Lucien looked at her with an expression she had learned to read only after years of practice, because he kept most of his interior life under lock and deliberate key. What she saw in his face now wasn't quite worry. It was closer to the thing a very skilled chess player feels when they see the board tilting in a direction they didn't choose. I'll come with you, he said. No. She said it more quickly than she intended to. She saw his jaw tighten just slightly. Lucien, you know what happens when you walk into a room full of strangers. She didn't have to explain further. When Lucien DeLuca entered a space, the space changed. The air pressure changed. Men who had never heard his name could feel something ancient and warning-shaped firing at the base of their skull. Men who had heard his name did considerably worse. A high school reunion full of people who still thought of themselves as the apex predators of a small social ecosystem. Those people did not need to be introduced to her husband. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Then I'll wait outside, he said. Lucien, I'll wait outside, Nia. His voice was very even. That is not negotiable. She looked at him for a long moment and understood that this was as much ground as he was going to give her. The man did not do helplessness gracefully. The idea of her walking into something potentially hostile while he sat at home on the other side of the city was simply not something his internal architecture could accommodate. Fine, she said. You wait outside, and you don't come in unless I call you. Agreed. She should have been more suspicious of how quickly he agreed. The venue was the Harrington Grand, a hotel ballroom in the old part of the city, the kind of place that had been renovated 3 times, and each renovation had added another layer of pretension without subtracting any of the original staleness underneath. Crystal chandeliers, circular tables dressed in white linen, a DJ in the corner playing music that was trying too hard to sound like their teenage years. Nia arrived at 7:45, 15 minutes after the posted start time, because she'd needed the extra 15 minutes sitting in the back of the car, convincing herself she could do this. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, full sleeves, empire cut, the kind of silhouette that worked with her body instead of against it, that emphasized her shoulders and her height, and nothing of the things that people had spent years turning into weapons. Her natural hair was out, a large defined coil of it that she'd spent 2 hours on that morning and that she was quietly proud of. She wore small gold earrings that Lucien had picked out in Positano on their 2nd anniversary. She did not wear her wedding ring. She had taken it off before she left. She hadn't entirely admitted to herself why she'd done it. Something about not wanting to walk in there holding her husband like a shield. Something about wanting to stand in that room as herself, and face whatever they threw at her on her own terms. She'd tucked the ring into the inside pocket of her clutch, and she'd felt its small weight there all the way to the hotel, like a promise she was keeping from the world. She handed her invitation to a young woman at a table near the entrance, who smiled the automatic smile of someone performing cheerfulness on an hourly wage, received a name tag, and walked in. The ballroom hit her like a temperature change. Not in temperature itself, the room was climate-controlled into a very neutral pleasantness. But in something else, some atmospheric pressure made up entirely of social dynamics and old hierarchies and the specific cruelty of people who had never needed to grow past the age of 17 because the world had always been gentle with them. She recognized faces immediately. That was the disorienting thing. 10 years had passed and people had changed. Softer here, sharper there, the men broader or thinner, the women in different configurations of expensive, and yet she knew them. Her brain cataloged them with a precision that embarrassed her. This was information she hadn't wanted to retain. Her memory had held on to these faces with the same grim tenacity with which a wound holds the shape of the thing that made it. She got herself a glass of sparkling water from the bar and stood near the edge of the room. She kept her chin level. She kept her shoulders back. She breathed through her nose slowly and methodically, the way she'd taught herself to breathe during the years when her own body had felt like the enemy. The first one to approach her was Marcus Webb. She recognized him from behind before she saw his face. The particular way he carried his shoulders, the self-satisfied set of them, unchanged from the 16-year-old who had once told her that she was the kind of girl men had dinner with, and then didn't call back. He'd said it like he was doing her a favor, like he was offering her a realistic preview of her future that she ought to be grateful for. He'd grown into a broad, slightly florid man who wore his suit like it was a size too small around the shoulders. He had a drink in each hand, which Nia suspected was not his first round of the evening. Nia Brooks. He said her name with the loud surprise of someone performing an emotion for an audience. I didn't think you were going to show. Marcus. She kept her voice neutral. You look... He paused in the specific way that people paused when they were deciding whether to say what they actually meant. He decided not to, or decided on a softer version of it. Good. You look good. Same old Nia. Same old Nia. She heard the whole sentence inside that one. She'd had 10 years to get very good at hearing the whole sentence inside the polite one. How are you? She asked, because she had manners even when she didn't want to use them. Fantastic. VP at Meridian Capital. Just closed a deal. And then he was off, talking about himself in the manner of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask him about himself and didn't much care whether the question had been enthusiastic or not. She half listened and kept her eyes moving over the room, taking a slow inventory of the evening ahead. That was when she saw Courtney Marsh. Courtney Marsh had been the most beautiful girl in their year. She knew she'd been the most beautiful girl in their year, in the way that monarchs knew they were monarchs, as a simple factual condition of existence that shaped everything around it. She had the kind of looks that people described as classic, straight nose, high cheekbones, a slenderness that their particular social culture had treated as a moral achievement rather than a genetic circumstance. She had also been, without question, the cruelest person Nia had ever personally encountered. Not loudly cruel. Courtney had never been loud. She was the kind of cruel that operated through a smile, through a tilt of the head, through carefully constructed sentences that could be plausibly denied on the surface while delivering maximum damage underneath. Courtney caught Nia's eye across the room, and her face did something complicated, something that moved through recognition, calculation, and amusement, all in the space of a single second, before resolving into the warm, open smile of a woman who was delighted to see an old friend. Nia felt her stomach drop 3 inches. She felt it drop, and she hated that she felt it drop, and she breathed through her nose and held herself together while Courtney began moving toward her through the crowd. Some things, she thought grimly, did not change. Courtney Marsh had not changed in 10 years in the way that certain sharks did not change. Everything still exactly as effective as it had ever been. She was wearing a white dress that cost more than most people's mortgage payments. Her hair fell in a deliberately casual way that had taken a team of people considerable effort to achieve. She held her champagne glass with the lazy confidence of someone who had never once worried about whether she was welcome somewhere. Nia. She said the name like it was a gift she was giving. Oh my gosh, you actually came. I actually came, Nia said. You know what? I love that you just commit, Courtney said, and managed to load those words with a cargo of meaning that would have been absolutely unquotable in any formal setting. She touched Nia's arm lightly. I love that you never change. Neither do you, Nia said, and meant it differently than Courtney would take it. Courtney laughed, the easy laugh of someone who expected that everything said in her direction was a compliment. She turned to Marcus, drew him into a brief exchange about someone they both knew, and Nia used the moment to breathe and steady herself and look around the room again. There were about 90 people in the ballroom. She estimated that perhaps 15 of them had been actively cruel to her during her time at Westbrook Academy. Another 30 or so had been what she privately classified as background cruel, the ones who hadn't initiated anything but had never missed an opportunity to laugh, who had treated her exclusion as a naturally occurring condition of the environment, like weather, nothing to do with them personally. She found an empty chair at a table near the edge of the room and sat down, because her feet hurt, and because she was tired of performing a comfort she didn't feel. A few people she vaguely remembered nodded at her. One woman, Michelle Park, who had once helped Nia with a chemistry assignment and been quietly kind about it, came over and sat next to her and asked genuine questions about her life. And for 20 minutes, Nia breathed normally and felt almost like a person at a normal gathering. Then the microphone came on. The class president, Tyler Boone, 15 years ago, and still, apparently because some men found a role at 17 that fit them so well they never saw a reason to take it off, stood at the podium with the easy authority of a man who had hosted events like this many times and enjoyed it. Welcome back, Westbrook Academy class of... And everyone cheered, and Tyler grinned, and the DJ faded the music down, and the evening's formal program began. It was during the open microphone portion. The open microphone portion. Why had she not anticipated that there would be an open microphone portion? That things began to turn. People stood up and gave small speeches. Some of them were funny. Some of them were genuinely warm. Some of them were the kind of performative nostalgia that mistook the edited highlight reel of memory for the full film. Nia clapped when appropriate and kept her expression pleasantly neutral. Then Courtney Marsh walked to the microphone. The room brightened in the specific way that rooms brighten when the most attractive person in them steps into the center of attention. It was a physical phenomenon. Nia had observed it many times over the years. She observed it now with the detached attention of someone who has learned not to expect to be part of the light. "I just want to say," Courtney began, with her warm, inclusive smile turned out toward the room like a flashlight, "how wonderful it is to see everyone, and I mean everyone." Her eyes found Nia, and the emphasis was so smooth, so surgically placed, that a person not paying close attention might have thought it was entirely accidental. "Some faces I honestly wasn't sure we'd ever see again." She paused. The room held the beat. Some people looked at Nia. Some people were the kind of practiced casual that meant they were very deliberately not looking at Nia. "Nia Brooks," Courtney said, and smiled wider. "Nia, we are so glad you made it. I was just saying to Tyler earlier, I wondered if Nia would need us to reserve a special—" And here she paused in a way that was a performance of itself, a pause that gathered its own audience, arrangement, for seating. She touched her own side lightly, almost imperceptibly. Almost. The laughter started small. A few isolated sounds, quickly suppressed. Then more. Then the full body of it moving through the room. The particular laughter of people who feel safe because they are laughing at someone who cannot reach them. Nia sat very still. She was good at sitting very still. She had had years of practice at it. She kept her chin level and her hands flat on the table, and she breathed through her nose, and she thought about the jasmine outside her kitchen window, and the way it smelled in the morning, and she absolutely did not let a single thing that was happening in her face be anything other than composed. She would not give them her face. She had decided that 10 years ago. They did not get her face. Courtney was still at the microphone, building on it now, her voice carrying the bright, warm innocence of someone who was merely making conversation, merely being welcoming, merely— "And no ring, Nia? Oh, don't be shy. We're all friends here." She pressed one hand to her chest in the gesture of someone confiding warmth. "I know you mentioned, was it a boyfriend or—" She lowered her voice theatrically, in the manner of sharing a confidence with 90 people simultaneously. "Or was that something you were still working on?" More laughter, louder this time. And Nia felt something give way inside her. Not her composure, she kept her composure, but something deeper, some last insulation between herself and the specific sharpness of this particular room, this particular hour, this particular category of wound. She felt it go. And then she felt her phone vibrate in her clutch. Once, then again. She didn't look at it, but she knew who it was. She knew because outside this hotel, idling in the dark in the third car of a 4-vehicle convoy, a man had just looked at his watch and felt something in his chest that was very precisely calibrated to the frequency of her distress. A man who had been still and patient and honoring his promise to wait. A man who did not remain still when the people he loved were being hurt. She had 12 seconds, she estimated. Maybe 15. Before the doors of the Harrington Grand opened in a way that nobody in this room was going to be ready for. And even though she had asked for this night alone, even though she had taken off her ring and walked in here as just herself, as Nia Brooks and nothing more, she found, sitting very still in the eye of her old classmate's laughter, that she did not reach for her phone to send him away. She found her hands in her lap. She found her chin level. She found her breathing slow and deliberate. She found herself waiting. The laughter was still moving through the room when the first door opened. Not both doors. Just one. The left one. It swung inward slowly, with the kind of deliberate unhurry that was somehow more alarming than if it had been kicked open. The sound of it cut under the laughter, and the laughter began to die at the edges first, the way fire dies at the edges of a wet surface, retreating toward its center. One man stepped through, then another, then a third. They were not small men. They wore dark suits that fit well enough to be expensive and moved with the particular efficiency of people who had been trained to assess a room in the first 4 seconds of entering it. Their eyes swept the ballroom in a pattern, systematic, almost geometric, that had nothing to do with looking for old friends or finding the bar. They were looking for exits. They were looking for threats. They were doing, in the middle of a hotel ballroom full of people holding champagne flutes, exactly what they were paid to do. The room felt it before it understood it. The laughter stopped. Not all at once. It tapered, stumbled, went silent in sections, like a power grid losing voltage from the far end. Courtney Marsh was still at the microphone. She had half turned toward the doors, and the warm smile on her face had shifted into something uncertain, something that hadn't yet decided what expression it wanted to become. Tyler Boone, standing at the edge of the podium, said, "What the?" and didn't finish it. Then the second door opened, and Lucien DeLuca walked into the Harrington Grand Ballroom. He wasn't moving fast. That was the first thing. He wasn't striding, wasn't performing, wasn't giving the room the satisfaction of a dramatic entrance that they could reduce to spectacle afterward. He was simply walking at the pace of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to hurry because the world rearranged itself around his schedule rather than the other way around. His hands were loose at his sides. His suit was black, not the festive black of a man who dressed for a party, but the flat, absolute black of a man who dressed for something, and it sat on his shoulders with the precision of a thing that had been made specifically for him by someone who understood that certain bodies needed to be contained rather than decorated. His face was calm. That was the second thing. And it was the calm that did it. The calm that was doing to the room what no anger could have done, because anger was readable. Anger was a known quantity. Anger had a shape and a ceiling and a predictable arc. This calm had no ceiling. This calm was the thing that lived on the other side of anger, the place that a man arrived at when he had moved through every shade of fury so many times that fury had simply become redundant. He walked past the first row of tables without looking at them, past the bar, past the cluster of former classmates near the center of the room who had physically drawn together the way animals drew together when something entered their environment that they couldn't classify. He was looking at Nia, only at Nia. She had stood up from her chair. She hadn't planned to stand up. Her body had just made that decision for her, pulled her upright the way a current pulled something beneath the surface. She watched him cross the room toward her, and she felt the composite sensation of it, the relief, the complicated gratitude, and underneath both of those things, the faint burn of the pride she'd been trying to protect by coming here alone. She'd wanted to do this herself. She'd wanted to prove, to herself more than to anyone in this room, that she didn't need saving. But she was also very, very tired, and he was here. And he was looking at her with an expression that contained within it the specific, undiluted knowledge of exactly what she was worth. Not what she weighed, not what she looked like in a dress in a ballroom full of people who'd once made her want to disappear, but what she was worth, and there was no performance in his face at all. He stopped in front of her, close. The bodyguards had fanned out behind him at a distance that was respectful of the moment, but absolutely not decorative. The room was silent enough that Nia could hear someone near the back exhale. Lucien reached out and took both her hands in his. His hands were large and very steady, and they took hers in the specific way that something anchors something else, not gripping, not restraining, just there, solid, unmovable. He looked at her face for a long moment, reading it. He was always reading it, and he was always accurate, and right now what he read in it made something in his jaw tighten for just a fraction of a second before he controlled it back to stillness. Then he said, quietly. Not quietly because he was being discreet, quietly because the room was absolutely silent, and he didn't need volume to fill it. "Did anyone here make my wife cry?" Nobody moved. Courtney Marsh, still standing at the microphone, made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a word. It didn't develop into one. Lucien didn't look around the room when he said it. He kept his eyes on Nia. It was somehow more devastating that way. The question delivered into her face, for her, because she was the only person in the room he was addressing, and the rest of them were simply collateral witnesses to a conversation between a husband and a wife. Nia felt something crack open in her chest. She'd been holding herself together with such concentrated effort for the last hour that the abrupt absence of the need to do it was almost disorienting. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned at the corners. "Don't," she said very quietly, and she meant don't watch me feel this. "I know," he said, with equal quietness, and she understood that he wasn't going to look away. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He produced a ring, her actual ring, the one she'd put in her clutch. He'd taken it from her clutch before she left. She understood this now, registered it with a distant, almost admiring fury. He'd taken it, and he'd had it with him all evening, waiting. The ring was a diamond solitaire, round cut, set in platinum, larger than anything she'd ever imagined herself wearing before Lucian. She'd resisted it when he first showed it to her. She'd told him it was too much. He'd put it on her finger, and she'd stopped arguing. He slipped it back onto her left hand now, with the same quiet deliberateness with which he'd done everything else this evening. Then he brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and he held them there for a moment, and he closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked up at her with that expression she'd learned after years of patient study. "You should have called me earlier," he said. "You weren't supposed to be in here at all," she said. "You also weren't supposed to be standing there without your ring." He released her hand carefully, like he was setting something fragile back in its place. "We can debate the specifics of the agreement later." From the far side of the room, Marcus Webb said, "Who the hell is that?" to the person standing next to him, and did it in the carrying tone of a man who'd drunk enough to lose his calibration for what was audible. Lucien turned his head. It was a very small movement, just the turn of his head, nothing more, and Marcus Webb visibly stopped breathing for a second. "He said he's her husband," said the woman next to Marcus, in a whisper that was also very audible because the room was still that quiet. "Did she say she was married?" "She didn't say anything," said someone else. "She didn't say anything all night." Courtney Marsh had finally stepped back from the microphone. She had retreated to the side of the small stage in a way that was trying to be casual and was not succeeding, because there was nothing casual about the specific quality of attention that Lucien DeLuca was now distributing across the room. He wasn't staring anyone down. He wasn't threatening. He was simply standing next to his wife with his hands relaxed at his sides and looking at the room with those eyes that had seen every version of every kind of person, and the room was discovering, one person at a time, that being seen by those eyes was not a comfortable experience. Tyler Boone, who had been class president for 3 terms, and who had the reflexive confidence of a man accustomed to managing social situations, made the mistake of stepping forward. "Hey, look, I don't know who you are, but this is a private event." "I know it's a private event," Lucien said. He said it without any particular inflection. "I'm here to collect my wife." "Right, but..." Tyler gestured in a way that was meant to be authoritative and landed somewhere closer to nervous. "You can't just walk in with..." He looked at the bodyguards. He looked back at Lucien. "This is..." "Tyler," Nia said. Tyler looked at her. He had the abrupt expression of a man who had just remembered that the woman in the room was not incidental to the situation. "You were about to finish the sentence," she said. "Go ahead." Tyler's mouth opened, closed. He was not a stupid man, not exactly, but he was a man who had spent the last decade in rooms where his authority was never questioned, and the unfamiliarity of the current situation was working against him. He looked at Lucien, looked at Naya, looked at the bodyguards arranged with their particular brand of patient lethality around the edges of the room, and he made the correct decision for the first time all evening, which was to say nothing. Lucien let the silence sit for exactly the right amount of time. Then he looked at Nia. "Are you ready to go?" She should have said yes. Every practical instinct she had said yes. She looked around the room, at Tyler's stiff back, at Marcus who had gone the color of something left out too long, at Courtney Marsh beside the stage, and she felt the strange, specific satisfaction of having survived something, but also the equally strange, specific dissatisfaction of having only survived it. She had come here for something, and she wasn't sure she'd gotten it yet. She wasn't sure what it was, exactly. Closure, confrontation, the simple fact of standing in this room as an adult woman who had built a real life and refusing to be made small by it. She was not small. She had never been small. She had just spent her teenage years in a building full of people who needed her to be. "No," she said. "Not yet." Lucien looked at her. A beat. "Okay," he said. He moved to stand beside her rather than in front of her. A specific, deliberate positioning that she noticed and was grateful for. Beside, not in front. He wasn't going to be her shield tonight. He was going to be her witness. It was Courtney who cracked first. Courtney Marsh had spent 20 years perfecting the performance of effortless superiority, and it was a very good performance, calibrated and practiced, and nearly seamless. But it had been built for a specific kind of audience, for rooms where she was the most powerful person, where her beauty and her social fluency gave her the home court advantage, where the people she aimed her barbs at had no resources with which to respond. She had no script for this room. "Look, this is obviously..." Courtney started, and she'd aimed for breezy but landed somewhere short of it. This is obviously sweet. The whole entrance, the ring, very romantic. She paused. But I think maybe we got a little carried away up there. It was just a joke. Everyone here knows it was just a joke. The room did not confirm that everyone knew it was just a joke. The room remained very quiet. Which part was the joke? Nia said. Courtney's eyes moved to her. Nia, the part where you asked if I needed extra seating, or the part where you told 90 people that nobody would want me? She kept her voice level. She'd had 10 years to plan what she'd say in a room like this, and now that she was in it, she wasn't saying any of those things, because those things had been written by the version of herself that was still wounded. And the version of herself standing here in a burgundy dress with a diamond ring on her finger and a husband at her side felt something other than wounded. Or was it the imaginary husband? Which part was the joke, Courtney? I want to make sure I'm laughing at the right part. Courtney's jaw was very tight. You're being dramatic, she said, and the warmth had gone out of her voice entirely, revealing the architecture underneath it, which was considerably colder. She's stating facts, Lucian said pleasantly. The pleasantness of his voice in that moment was more alarming than anything else he'd done all evening. Several people near the back of the room shifted weight from one foot to the other. I don't think I was talking to you, Courtney said, and her chin had come up in the way that it came up when she was on uncertain ground and overcompensating. No, Lucian agreed. You were talking about my wife, which amounts to the same thing. Your wife. Courtney said it with a very thin smile. Right. And who exactly are you? I'm sorry, I don't think we've been introduced. Lucian looked at her with those calm eyes for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was a very contained smile, and it did not reach his eyes at all. No, he said, we haven't. He didn't offer anything further. The implied sufficiency of his presence, the absolute lack of any need to explain or prove himself, filled the space where an introduction might have gone, and it was somehow more damning than any answer he could have provided. Marcus Webb cleared his throat. I heard the name DeLuca, he said, loudly enough for it to carry, and then immediately looked as though he wished he hadn't said it. The name moved through the room. Not every person in the room knew it, but enough did. Enough had read enough, heard enough, been in enough business meetings where that name came up sideways in conversations about certain contracts, certain territories, certain understandings that underpin the commerce of the city like load-bearing walls that nobody in polite company discussed openly. Nia watched it happen. She watched the knowledge move through the room like a change in temperature, person to person, the subtle recalibration of expression that happened when people understood that they had made a very significant error in their assessment of a situation. She'd seen it before, in other contexts, on other people's faces. She had never seen it on the faces of people who had spent years making her feel worthless, and she found that it produced in her a feeling she hadn't entirely anticipated, not triumph, something quieter than triumph, something that felt more like closing a door. But before she could fully inhabit that feeling, something happened that none of them had planned for. Jennifer Holt, who had sat 3 rows behind Nia in every class they'd shared, who had never said anything to Nia's face, but whose running commentary in the margins of the social hierarchy had been as cruel as anything more overt. Jennifer Holt, who had had 4 glasses of champagne and whose social filter was apparently not rated for this level of stress, said from somewhere near the middle of the room, "She probably told him she was thin. That's probably why he—" She didn't finish the sentence because the woman next to her grabbed her arm, but the sentence had been said. In a room that was absolutely silent, in a room where every single person had heard it, including Lucien DeLuca, who went very still in the way that very dangerous things went very still. Nia felt his hand find hers, not her knuckles this time, the full grip, fingers interlaced with hers, his thumb pressing firmly into the back of her hand. She could feel the tension in it. She could feel the effort of containment in it. She squeezed back. Hard. Don't. Not yet. He looked at her. She looked at him and shook her head, very slightly, and she felt in his grip the specific, enormous effort that it cost him to redirect. She felt it move through his hand into hers, and she absorbed it, and she held it, and she said nothing. Jennifer Holt was standing very still near the middle of the room. Her face had gone a color that had no attractive name. She was staring at the floor, and she was aware, with the full body awareness of someone who has just understood their mistake too late, that the man 3 feet from her had heard every word and was choosing because his wife was asking him to choose, not to respond. The thing about Lucien de Luca's restraint was that it was somehow worse than his lack of it would have been. When a man capable of anything chose to do nothing, the room felt the weight of everything he wasn't doing. It pressed down on them. Into the silence, Nia said calmly, "I think we should all sit down." Nobody sat, but nobody argued either. "You've been putting on a show for this room since you were 17 years old," Nia said to the room in general, and her voice was level and clear and didn't waver at all. "Most of you haven't stopped, and I get it. I do. This is the only room where some of you ever felt like the most important person in it. This is the room where the rules were written in your favor, and you knew all of them, and you used them." "Sikwai potsui sun," she paused. "But it's been 10 years, and you're still here, playing the same game, with the same people. And I genuinely don't know if that's sad or just boring." She felt Lucian's grip on her hand shift very slightly into something that was less restraint and more, she recognized this, pride. "I came here tonight to prove something to myself," she said. "I think I'm done." She turned to Lucian. He was already looking at her. "Now I'm ready," she said. He nodded. He began to move toward the exit, her hand in his, the bodyguards moving into configuration around them with the fluid efficiency of water finding its course. They had almost reached the doors when Tyler Boone's voice came from behind them, strained with the particular desperation of a man who could not bear to be the administrator of an evening that ended this way. "You think you're better than us? Is that it?" The champagne was loud in his voice. "Because your husband has money? Because he brought bodyguards to a reunion?" Lucian stopped walking. Nia felt it. The stop, the specific quality of it, like a gear catching. She tightened her hand in his. He turned, slowly, and he looked at Tyler Boone across the room with that expression, the very still one, the one without a ceiling. "I don't think anything about you," Lucien said quietly. "But I have thought, in the last 20 minutes, about every person in this room who spoke to my wife the way you people spoke to her tonight. And I want you to understand something." He paused, just long enough. "I have a very good memory and a great deal of patience." He held Tyler's gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned back toward the door. It was only as they reached the lobby, only as the cool air of the corridor hit Nia's face and the sounds of the ballroom fell behind them, that she realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, not from grief exactly, from the sustained physical effort of the last 2 hours of holding herself together, and the sudden release of no longer needing to. Lucien noticed. He stopped walking and turned to face her and put both hands on her face with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something they valued immensely. "Hey," he said. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice came out more unsteady than she'd intended. "I know you are," he said. "You were fine in there for 2 hours by yourself. You don't have to keep being fine right this second." She closed her eyes. Just for a moment, felt his thumbs against her temples, his palms warm against her jaw. "I didn't want you to see them do that to me," she said. "I know. I wanted to handle it myself." "You did handle it yourself." His voice was very certain. "I was furniture." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to it, and she felt the first tear move down her face, and she was too tired to stop it. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, standing in the marble corridor of the Harrington Grand with the ballroom at their backs, was that back inside that room, Tyler Boone had taken out his phone with hands that weren't entirely steady. That Courtney Marsh was having a conversation in a low, rapid voice with Marcus Webb about damage control and perception, and does anyone actually know who he is, or is it just a rumor? That Jennifer Holt had gone to the bathroom and was sitting on the floor of a stall trying to remember if she had said what she thought she'd said and whether anyone had filmed it. And that one of Lucien's men, a compact, quiet man named Dario, who had been standing near the service corridor entrance for the last 25 minutes, had been writing down names, not addresses, not numbers, just names. The specific, complete, legal names of every individual who had stood up in that room and directed cruelty at Nia Brooks DeLuca. He had 7 names so far. He was not finished. Dario had 9 names by the time he folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. He did it with the unhurried precision of a man who had performed this specific action, the documentation of people who had made a mistake many times before. He did not look at the names again after he wrote them. He didn't need to. He had a reliable memory and a professional's relationship with information. You gathered it, you stored it correctly, you delivered it to the person who needed it, and you did not editorialize. Dario had worked for Lucien DeLuca for 11 years, and the 2 things that had kept him employed that long were his discretion and his complete absence of personal feeling about his work. He straightened his jacket and walked toward the service exit without looking at anyone in the room. Behind him, the ballroom had begun the slow, uneven process of returning to something that resembled normal. People picking up conversations with the careful self-consciousness of people who knew they were performing normalcy rather than feeling it. The DJ having the good instinct to bring the music back up at low volume. A few people drifting toward the bar with the specific purposefulness of people who needed a drink and were not embarrassed about needing it. Tyler Boone was standing near the podium with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man running calculations. He'd been running calculations since Lucien DeLuca's name moved through the room like a current, since he'd seen the way the bodyguards moved and understood in the animal part of his brain that his years of business school hadn't managed to domesticate, that he had said something to a man he should not have said things to. Tyler was $42,000 in debt to a private lender whose interest rate was not the kind discussed in polite company. He was also, though only 4 people on the planet currently knew this, 2 weeks away from an SEC inquiry into certain transactions involving his investment firm's handling of the Alumni Endowment Fund. He had been managing this particular exposure with the skill of someone spinning plates, adding new plates as the old ones wobbled, and the system had been holding together through a combination of confidence and momentum and the basic human tendency to believe that things would resolve themselves if you simply kept moving. He stared at his phone. He stared at the door through which Lucien DeLuca had just walked. He thought about what Dario, though he did not know Dario's name, had been doing in the corner with that small notebook for the last half hour, and he felt the plates beginning to wobble. Marcus Webb had found a table and sat down heavily in a chair that creaked under him. He had set his drink on the table and was looking at it without drinking it. The name DeLuca was doing things in his chest that he couldn't fully name. He knew the name. He knew it the way anyone who moved in certain financial circles in this city knew it, which was at a careful distance, with the instinctive awareness that some information was best encountered briefly and then not thought about again. He had not, until approximately 20 minutes ago, connected that name to the heavy girl from high school who used to eat lunch alone in the library. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. It was a message from his assistant, Meridian Capital, called. They've put the Rexford deal on hold pending review. No reason given. Marcus read the message twice. The Rexford deal was $4.2 million in commission. It had been signed, sealed, in 36 hours from closing. He looked at the door again. Then he looked at his phone. Then at the door. Then he put the phone face down on the table with the deliberate motion of a man who was not ready to deal with what was on it. Courtney Marsh was in the corner near the stage, talking to a woman named Priya Sahani, who ran a lifestyle blog with 800,000 followers and had been Courtney's social infrastructure since junior year of high school. Their voices were low and rapid, and their faces had the taut quality of women running rapid damage assessment. Did anyone film it? Courtney asked. Sarah might have had her phone out, Priya said. Find out. Court, find out and make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Courtney's voice was flat. The warmth had been off since Lucy Yen walked in, and it had not come back. This was the version of Courtney that Priya had seen maybe a dozen times in 20 years, stripped of the performance, just the infrastructure of her. It was not a comfortable version to be near. I was making a joke. The microphone thing was, I know. It was a reunion. It's what people do at, I know, Courtney. And she walks in here with him, with all of that. Courtney gestured in the direction of the door, a short, sharp gesture that contained considerable feeling. Like some kind of, you need to stop talking, Priya said, quietly and with the firmness of someone who had been cleaning up after Courtney's mouth for 2 decades. Right now, you need to stop talking and think very carefully about the next 12 hours. Courtney looked at her. She looked at Priya with the expression of someone who was unaccustomed to being told to stop, and was furthermore unaccustomed to the feeling that the instruction was correct. She stopped talking. What she did not say, and what Priya did not know, and what the 800,000 followers of her lifestyle blog absolutely could not know, was that the boutique Courtney owned, Maison Marche, 3 locations, beautifully curated, photographed in the right magazines, had been underreporting sales revenue for 31 months. It was not a dramatic number. It was the kind of number that accumulated quietly when a woman who liked beautiful things spent slightly more than a beautiful business could support, and solved the gap through a method that her accountant had described as a gray area and that 3 tax attorneys would have described, with more precision, as fraud. She had been managing it. She was always managing it. The management was the work that nobody photographed for the right magazines. She picked up her champagne glass, found it empty, set it down again. Priya was typing something on her phone. Courtney looked at the door one more time, and then she looked at the ring. The ring she'd seen Lucian slide onto Nia's finger. The ring that had caught the light in a way that Courtney, who knew diamonds the way musicians knew pitch, understood immediately was not decorative. That ring was real. That ring was the kind of real that was a statement, and the man who'd put it there had looked at Nia Brooks, who used to eat lunch alone in the library, with a kind of attention that Courtney had spent her entire life trying to generate in rooms full of people, and had never quite achieved in private. It was that, more than the bodyguards, more than the name that had moved through the room like weather, that was doing something unexpected to Courtney Marsh's interior. She didn't have a word for it. She was not, honestly, a woman who spent much time in her interior. But whatever it was unpleasant, and she wished she could put it down somewhere. Outside the Harrington Grand, in the 3rd car of a 4-vehicle convoy, Nia sat with her shoes off and her feet tucked under her on the leather seat, and she was not crying anymore. She had cried for approximately 4 minutes in the lobby corridor, efficiently and without drama, and then she had wiped her face and put her shoes back on and walked out to the car. The crying had not felt like weakness. It had felt like bleeding off pressure, like a valve releasing, and she felt now not empty but lighter, the way a room felt lighter after a window was opened. Lucien was sitting across from her, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching her with the particular quality of attention that he reserved for things that mattered to him. He had a phone in one hand and he was not looking at it. "You should have let me go alone," she said. "Probably," he said. "I mean it, Lucien. I asked you. You asked me to wait outside," he said. "And I waited outside 47 minutes. And then you came in anyway. You didn't send the car away." He set the phone down on the seat beside him. "You had 47 minutes to send the car away. You didn't." She looked at him. She wanted to argue this and found, to her irritation, that she couldn't. She had known the car was there. She had known what it meant that the car was still there. She had made the decision to keep it there without fully admitting to herself that she was making it, and Lucien, who was fluent in the language of what she admitted and what she didn't, had read it accurately. "I wanted to do it myself," she said. And she knew, even as she said it, that the past tense of it was the operative thing. Wanted. She had wanted to. And then she had sat in that room for 47 minutes and felt the room disassemble her with the precision of people who had spent years practicing exactly this. And some want had given way to something else that she didn't have a clean word for. "You did do it yourself," he said. "What you said in there. Don't." "Nia, I don't want to be told I was brave," she said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "Not tonight. I know what I was. I was surviving. I've been surviving that room since I was 14. I'm very good at it, and I'm also very tired of being good at it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved past the tinted windows. Streetlights, storefronts, the late-night geometry of a city that didn't slow down because one woman had gone to her high school reunion and had a difficult evening. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. His phone lit up on the seat beside him. He glanced at it, and something in his face changed, very slightly, in a way that Nia caught because she was always watching his face. "What?" she said. He picked up the phone and read what was on it. He read it for longer than she would have expected, which meant it was either long or complex, and Lucien processed information quickly. The pause meant complex. "Lucien, He looked up at her, and she saw in his face the thing that she had learned over 3 years of marriage to this man was the most serious expression in his vocabulary. Not anger, not coldness. Something that sat underneath both of those things. The bedrock that they were built on. The thing that appeared when the situation had moved past the point where his personal feelings about it were relevant. "Tell me," she said. He handed her the phone. The message was from a contact listed only as V, which she knew was Vincent, who was the closest thing Lucian had to a deputy and who communicated with the brevity of a man who'd learned that extra words in their line of work were a form of exposure. The message read, "Caruso is at the Harrington, 2nd floor. He's been there since 8. Nia read it. She read it again. She looked up at Lucian. "The Harrington Grand," she said. "Our Harrington Grand, tonight." Yes. She felt the architecture of the evening rearrange itself in her understanding. All of it, the reunion, the venue, the timing, took on a different geometry. "Tell me who Caruso is," she said, because she needed him to say it out loud, needed to hear it in his voice to be certain of what she was understanding. Lucien took the phone back from her. He set it face down. He looked at her with that bedrock expression. "Rafael Caruso is the man who has been trying to acquire my operations in the Northeast Corridor for 14 months, he said. "He does this by finding the things that people care about and making them unsafe." The silence in the car was different now, heavier. "He didn't come to the reunion," Lucien said. "He came to find out where I would be." Another pause. "Where you would be." Nia felt the cold settle into her. Not panic. She was not a woman who panicked easily. She had married into a life that had required her to learn, with some urgency, the difference between a situation that warranted panic and a situation that warranted clear thought. But this cold was something she didn't immediately have a category for. Because the reunion, her reunion, the thing that had been entirely about her past, about her pain, about the small and personal geography of who she used to be before she became who she was, had not been entirely about that at all. She said, "He knew I was going to be here." "Someone told him," Lucian said. "Yes. Someone told him I was going to be here," she said, and she said it slowly because she was building something with the words, assembling a structure. "Before I decided to come. Because I only decided 3 days ago and I didn't tell anyone outside the house." Lucian's eyes held hers. "Who knew?" she said. "Outside of the house." "One person," he said. "That I know of." She thought about the invitation, the cream envelope with the gold italic script, her maiden name, the address, her actual address, not the one she'd used before she was married, not the old forwarding address her mother had for her, but the brownstone, the real address, the one she had been careful about. "Tyler Boone sent the invitations," she said. "Yes. Tyler Boone, who is 2 weeks from an SEC inquiry into the Alumni Fund," she said, and she watched Lucien's face for confirmation, saw it in the specific quality of his stillness. "Tyler Boone, who needed something to trade." "That would be my read," Lucien said. She sat with that for a moment. She sat with the full weight of it, the understanding that the evening she had dreaded, the room full of old cruelties, the microphone, Courtney's voice with its carefully aimed warmth, all of it had been, at least in part, a constructed location. A place to put her. A place to know she would be, and therefore to know where Lucien would be, and therefore to have something to offer someone who wanted that information. She had walked into that room feeling like a target because of her body, because of the way she looked in a dress, because of every stupid, brutal, formative wound. And she had been a target, but for a reason that had nothing to do with any of that. "He used the reunion," she said. "He used you," Lucien said, and his voice was very quiet and very precise, "to find me." The car had stopped. She hadn't registered it stopping. They were still at the curb outside the hotel. She could see the entrance in the window behind Lucien, the lit facade, the doorman, the ordinary flow of a hotel evening proceeding without apparent awareness of what was happening in the vehicles at the curb. "Is he still up there?" she said. "Vincent says yes." "What does he want?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. Outside, a couple exited the hotel laughing, pulling their coats on. The man hailing a taxi. Ordinary, oblivious. "Rafael Caruso wants a conversation," Lucian said. He wants it in a public location with enough civilians around that the conversation cannot turn into anything other than a conversation. He paused. He has chosen well. He's been planning this for longer than tonight, she said. Much longer. He knew about me, she said. He knew you'd come. He knew I'd come, Lucy said. Yes. Nia looked at the entrance of the Harrington Grand. She thought about the room on the second floor where a man named Rafael Caruso had been sitting since 8 o'clock this evening, sitting and waiting and watching the clock and knowing that at some point in the evening, the husband would appear. She thought about what it meant that he'd chosen the reunion. Not a restaurant, not a hotel bar, not a neutral location. He'd chosen this place, this evening, which meant he'd known about the reunion, which meant the intelligence ran deeper than Tyler Boone's information, which meant, how long has he had someone close to us? She said. The question landed between them with a particular weight. Lucian looked at her with an expression that was, for one very unguarded moment, something that she had almost never seen on his face. He didn't answer immediately, and his not answering was itself an answer, was the specific admission of a man who did not yet know the full shape of what he was facing and was unwilling to construct false comfort in the gap. I don't know, he said. Those 3 words, from this man, in this car, on this evening, were the most alarming things she'd heard all night. More alarming than the microphone. More alarming than Jennifer Holt's voice. More alarming than the name Caruso itself. Lucian DeLuca did not say, I don't know, unless what he didn't know was genuinely large. Okay, she said. She heard the evenness in her own voice, and she understood it not as calm, but as the thing that arrived when a person understood that calm was the only viable option. What do you need from me? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 12 seconds, in which he said 4 words, bring the car around, and then ended it. I need you to go home, he said. Lucien, Naya. His voice had the quality that it had when he was not making a request. I need you to go home. I need you to be there. I need to know where you are. She looked at him. She understood that this was not about protecting her from the weight of a difficult conversation. Lucien had never protected her from difficult things. He had given her the truth of his life with a directness that had initially frightened her, and that she had come to understand was the deepest form of respect he knew how to offer. He was not sending her home to shield her. He was sending her home because if she was home and he knew she was there, he could do what needed doing with both hands free. You'll call me, she said, the moment it's done. She picked up her shoes from the floor of the car. She looked at the ring on her hand. Her ring, back on her finger, heavy and real. She thought about the moment he'd put it there in front of all those people. The specific deliberateness of it, the statement it made that was not for those people at all, but only for her. The person on the inside, she said, the one Caruso has. They were at the reunion. It wasn't a question. Lucien didn't respond to it as one. That's the most likely source of the timing, he said. Yes. She thought about the list. 9 names on a piece of paper in Dario's jacket pocket. 9 people who had put their cruelty on display tonight. And one of them, possibly, was not merely cruel but was something considerably more deliberate. She thought about Courtney Marsh near the stage. She thought about Tyler Boone with his phone and his wobbling plates. She thought about Marcus Webb, who'd heard Lucien's name and had gone the color of old paper. You'll find out who it is, she said. Yes, he said, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once left something he needed to know unknown. The door opened. The driver was there. The second car had pulled up behind the convoy, and Naya understood this was her car, the one taking her home, the arrangement that had been made in the 12-second call. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, and then she stopped and turned back to the open door. Lucien, she said. He looked at her from inside the car, his face in the shadow of the interior, only his eyes clearly visible. Whatever he tells you up there, she said, whatever he thinks he knows, whatever leverage he thinks he has. She paused. He picked the wrong night to put this on your plate. Lucien looked at her for a moment, and then something moved in his expression. Not the smile exactly, but the precursor to it, the interior version of it. Go home, Nia, he said quietly. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she turned and walked to the second car and got in and did not look back as it pulled away from the curb. Inside the Harrington Grand, on the second floor, In a corner table of a bar that catered to business travelers and kept its lighting dim and its music low, a man named Rafael Caruso was on his second glass of water and his fourth hour of waiting. He was not an impatient man by nature. Patience was one of the things he was most proud of, the long game his preferred mode of operation, the gradual closing of a hand around a thing rather than the grab. He was 51 years old and he had gray at his temples, and a face that had been handsome once and was now simply authoritative, the kind of face that had seen enough to have stopped performing anything for anyone. He wore a gray suit and no tie, and he sat with his hands on the table and he watched the door. His phone lit up. He looked at it. He's coming up. Caruso straightened in his chair. He picked up his water glass. He set it down. He composed his face into the expression he used for these meetings. Open, reasonable, the expression of a man interested in a mutually beneficial arrangement, which was the expression he used regardless of whether the arrangement was mutual or beneficial or anything other than a closing trap with a pleasant face. He heard the elevator open down the hall. He heard the particular cadence of footsteps that he'd been briefed to expect, unhurried, deliberate, the gait of a man who had nowhere he needed to be faster than where he already was. And then Lucien De Luca walked into the bar, and Caruso understood immediately, in the first second, that something was different from what he'd planned for. Lucien was alone, no Dario, no bodyguards flanking him, no visible security at all, just the man himself, moving through the low-lit room with his hands loose at his sides, and his jacket still on, and his face set to that expression, the one with no ceiling. Caruso had been told that Lucien De Luca always moved with security. Always. It was one of the most consistent facts about him, one of the structural elements that Caruso's plan had been built around. The certainty that the man would not expose himself, that the presence of civilians would create a manageable friction, that the conversation would stay a conversation. Lucien walked to Caruso's table and pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. The two men looked at each other. "Mr. De Luca," Caruso said. He kept his voice even. "I appreciate you. Where is your person?" Lucien said. Caruso blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The person you have inside my organization." Lucien's voice was completely flat. Not angry, not threatening. Flat, in the way that a certain kind of surface was flat because everything had been removed from it. "They're at the reunion downstairs. I need a name." Caruso held his expression for a moment. Then he allowed himself a small, careful smile. "I think you have the wrong Raphael." Lucien said the name with the particular weight of a man using a name to mark the end of a preamble. "I'm going to tell you one thing before we continue. My wife is in a car right now, moving through this city, and I know exactly where she is. I know this because she told me, and because the car has people in it that I trust, and because in 11 years of building what I've built, the circle of people I trust has gotten smaller every year." He paused. "Tonight it got smaller again, because someone in that room told you my wife was going to be here, and that person is one of 9 people on a list that a man named Dario made in his notebook 40 minutes ago." Another pause. "I'm going to find out which one. What you can do in this conversation is decide whether the finding out goes quickly or whether it takes the kind of time that tends to be uncomfortable for everyone involved." Caruso set down his water glass. He looked at Lucien De Luca across the table and he felt, for the first time in this very carefully constructed evening, the unpleasant sensation of a plan developing a significant structural flaw. He had planned for anger. He had planned for threats. He had planned for the kind of power display that powerful men defaulted to when their territory was challenged. He had not planned for this particular quality of certainty, for a man who had already finished the calculation and was simply waiting for the variable he hadn't yet solved. "You're very confident," Caruso said, for a man who walked into a room alone. "I walked in alone," Lucien said, "because I don't need anyone else for this conversation." He held Caruso's gaze with an evenness that was almost geological. The name, Raphael. Outside the Harrington Grand, in the second car moving through the city toward the brownstone, Nia sat with her shoes in her lap and her ring on her finger and her eyes on the passing lights, and she was thinking about 9 names on a piece of paper and which one of them had done something that went so far beyond the cruelty of a high school reunion that it had a different name entirely. Her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it. 4 words. "You should have stayed home." She stared at the message. She read it twice. She looked up at the driver's partition and said, very calmly, "I need you to call Lucien." The driver said, "He's in a meeting, Mrs. DeLuca." "I know where he is," she said. "Call him anyway." The driver reached for his phone. Nia looked back at the message on her screen and felt the full understanding of it settle into her. The understanding that whoever had sent this knew she was in this car, knew she had left the hotel, knew which direction she was going. The circle of people who knew that was very small. The car turned left onto Merchant Street, and the city lights moved across the windows, and Nia held her phone and felt the cold that she had felt in the hotel car return, sharper this time, more specific, with the particular edge of a danger that was not behind her anymore but was somewhere out ahead. The call connected on the second ring. "Nia, someone texted me," she said. "Unknown number. 4 words. You should have stayed home." 3 seconds of silence. She counted them. "Read me the number, Lucien said. She read it. She heard him relay it to someone in the room with him. Not Caruso, a different voice, closer, which meant Dario had materialized somewhere on the second floor without her knowing he'd been there. She heard Lucien's voice drop into a register she recognized as operational, the register that meant the calculation had shifted and the new variables were being processed in real time. "The car," he said. "Is it moving?" "Yes." Merchant Street, heading north. "Tell Marco to change the route. Now, don't take the bridge." She leaned toward the partition. "Marco, don't take the bridge. Different route home." Marco didn't ask why. That she had come to understand over 3 years was one of the baseline competencies of anyone who worked in proximity to Lucien. You did not ask why when the instruction was clear and the timing was urgent. Marco's hands moved on the wheel, and the car turned right onto Callaway, and the familiar geometry of her usual route home disappeared behind them. "Lucien," she said. "How bad is this?" Another pause. Shorter. "I need 4 minutes," he said. "Stay on the line." She stayed on the line, she held the phone against her ear, and she looked out the window at the city, and she felt the specific quality of these 4 minutes as something physical. A pressure in her chest, the kind that arrived when a situation had outgrown the container she'd been keeping it in. She was good at containing things. She had been containing things since she was 14 years old. But this was different from everything she'd been containing all evening because this was not about the past. This was not Courtney Marsh's voice through a microphone or Tyler Boone's face doing its calculations. This was something moving in the present, in the dark, in the specific geography of the next 20 minutes of her life. She did not feel panic. She kept waiting for panic and it didn't arrive. And she understood this not as bravery but as a simple neurological fact. Her system had been in a state of elevated alertness since she'd walked into the Harrington Grand Ballroom 4 hours ago, and it had metabolized the gradual escalation of the evening without fully registering each individual step, the way you didn't notice the temperature of water rising if you'd been in it long enough. What she felt instead was clarity, the very specific, almost brittle clarity of a person who has run out of room to equivocate. On Merchant Street, 3 blocks behind where the car had turned, a black sedan that had been maintaining a careful distance since the hotel parking structure took the same right onto Callaway and maintained its careful distance. The driver's name was Pell. He was 29 years old, and he had a phone in his right hand, and he was looking at the taillights of the car in front of him, and he was not thinking about Nia Brooks or Lucien DeLuca as people. He was thinking about a number, a specific 6-figure number, and the conditions attached to it, which were simple. Follow the car, report the route, do not engage. He was a man of limited complexity, and the simplicity of the instruction suited him. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A single word from the number he'd been given 3 days ago, confirmed. He set the phone on the seat beside him and followed the taillights north. He did not notice the vehicle that pulled out of a side street 2 blocks behind him. He did not notice because it had no headlights, and because it moved with the particular unhurried patience of something that was not chasing but simply accompanying, closing the geometry of the situation from a direction that Pell had not been briefed to account for. In the bar on the second floor of the Harrington Grand, Lucien lowered the phone from his ear for 11 seconds. She counted those too, listening to the particular quality of silence that meant he was looking at something, reading something, processing. And then he put it back. The text came from a burner, he said. Bought 3 days ago. Same day the convoy schedule for next week was accessed from an internal terminal. She absorbed this. The terminal, she said. That's inside. Yes. 3 days ago, she said. The same day I told you I was going to the reunion. Yes. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then she opened them. It's someone in the house, she said. Not a question. It's someone with access to the house's operational schedule, Lucian said, and his voice had the flatness of a man who was not yet ready to say the full thing out loud, because saying it out loud made it a fact, and he was still, by some margin, a few seconds behind the fact. Which narrows it. How narrow? 6 people, he said. She thought about those 6 people. She knew all of them. She had eaten meals in the presence of all of them. One of them brought her coffee in the morning when Lucien was traveling and she was in the house alone. One of them had driven her to the airport 4 times in the last year. One of them had stood in her kitchen and listened to her talk about this reunion with the patient attentiveness of someone who gave a damn. Lucien, she said, I know. You need to. Nia, I need you to focus on the car right now. His voice was deliberate and careful. Are you on Callaway? Yes. There's a parking structure on Callaway at 19th. Gray building, red lettering. Marco knows it. She looked at Marco. Marco nodded once, eyes on the road. We see it, she said. Go in, level 3. Stay in the car. Do not get out of the car for any reason. And then? And then, he said, I'll come to you. He ended the call. She lowered the phone and held it in her lap and felt the weight of the last 6 hours settle through her like sediment, every layer of the evening depositing itself into a new and different shape than she'd started with. She had come to the Harrington Grand to face the room that had broken her at 14. She was ending the evening in a parking structure on Callaway, while somewhere behind her, a car that should not have known her route was still trying to figure out where she'd gone. The parking structure appeared on the left. Marco turned in without signaling. The interior was concrete and fluorescent and smelled of oil and cold air, and the transition from the nighttime city to the structure's flat gray light was abrupt enough to feel like a change in reality. Level 1. Ramp. Level 2. Ramp. Level 3. Marco pulled into a space near the center of the level, engine idling. He did not turn the engine off. He put his hand under his jacket in the way that people put their hand under their jacket when they wanted the thing under their jacket to be immediately accessible. Nia sat in the back seat and breathed through her nose and looked at the concrete ceiling and thought about 6 people. She was still thinking about them when the phone rang. Unknown number, different from the text. She answered it. Mrs. DeLuca. The voice was male, middle-aged, carrying the specific accent of someone who'd learned English carefully and later than childhood. I apologize for the text message. It was sent without my authorization. A subordinate making an independent decision. A pause. I dislike independent decisions. Rafael Caruso, she said. A beat of silence that carried, she thought, a measure of genuine surprise. You know who I am, he said. I know who you are, she said. My husband mentioned you 20 minutes ago. Ah. Another pause. Then he also told you what I want. He told me you want a conversation, she said. You appear to be having one. With the wrong DeLuca, Caruso said, and there was a thread of something in his voice that was almost appreciation. I had hoped to speak with your husband at the hotel. The conversation didn't go as I'd planned. He has that effect. Yes, he does. A sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, not completed. Mrs. DeLuca, I want you to understand something. I have no interest in you personally. You are... He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that words, in certain conversations, had the weight of actions. You are a variable I had not fully accounted for. That is my error. I am acknowledging it. That's very gracious, she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. What do you want from me? I want you to deliver a message to your husband, Caruso said. The message is this. I know about the Rotterdam accounts. I know about the Ferreira arrangement, and I know the name of the federal contact who has been building a case for the last 14 months. Another pause. I am not an enemy. I am a man who wants a seat at the table. I believe the information I have is worth a seat. The car was very quiet. Marco was looking straight ahead, both hands visible on the steering wheel, not listening, or performing not listening with professional integrity. You're not threatening him, Nia said slowly. You're applying for a job. I'm demonstrating value, Caruso said. There is a difference. The person in his organization, she said. The one feeding you information. That's your demonstration. Partly, he said. And the text message. As I said, unauthorized. His voice had a controlled edge that suggested the person who'd sent it was going to have a difficult conversation of their own in the near future. I want your husband to know that I can be a source of intelligence rather than a source of threat. That is the entire message. Nia sat with that for a moment. She felt the shape of it, turned it over, looked at the side of it that Caruso wasn't presenting. You chose my reunion, she said. Of all the places and all the nights, you chose this one. It was the only occasion in 6 months when your husband's location could be predicted with certainty, Caruso said simply. He loves you very much, Mrs. DeLuca. That kind of love is the most reliable variable in an otherwise unpredictable man. She said nothing. I mean that as a compliment, he said. To you both. You used me, she said, to find him. That's what happened tonight. Yes, Caruso said, with a directness that was almost disarming. I did. And I'm aware that this is not a foundation for goodwill. It's why I'm calling you, rather than waiting for your husband to find me at a time and place of his choosing. A pause. Which he would. Eventually. I have enough respect for him to understand that. So this call is a surrender, she said. This call is a repositioning, Caruso said. There is a difference. Nia looked at the ring on her hand. The diamond caught the fluorescent light of the parking structure and threw it back in a small, cold point of brightness. I'll give him the message, she said. The decision is his. Of course, Caruso said. Tell him I'll be at the Harrington bar until 2. After that, the offer closes and we return to the alternative, which is messier for everyone. The call ended. Nia lowered the phone. She looked at Marco. Marco was looking straight ahead with the careful non-expression of a man pretending very hard not to have heard a word of what had just happened. Marco, she said. Yes, Mrs. DeLuca. Call Lucienne. Yes, Mrs. DeLuca. The call connected in under 10 seconds, which meant Lucienne had been waiting for it. She relayed everything. Not a summary, not her interpretation, the actual words, as close to verbatim as she could reconstruct them, because she understood that in this particular conversation the exact words were the data and her editorial on them was irrelevant. She heard him listen. She heard the specific quality of his silence as she spoke, the active silence of a man building a structure out of what he was hearing. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment, then, Rotterdam. That's what he said. He knows about Rotterdam, Lucian said very quietly, and there was something in those 4 words that she hadn't heard in his voice in a long time. Not fear. She had never, in 3 years, heard fear in his voice. Something adjacent to it. The recognition of exposure, the specific sensation of a man who had maintained a perimeter for a very long time, discovering that the perimeter had a hole he hadn't found yet. Lucienne, she said, the person in the house, the 6 people. Yes, Rotterdam. How many of those 6 know about Rotterdam? Silence. 2. He said. She felt something close around the answer like a hand closing around a thing. 2 people. Out of 6. And one of them had accessed the schedule terminal 3 days ago, and one of them had been bringing her coffee in the morning, and one of them, Lucienne, she said, is one of the 2 people Vincent? The silence that followed was the longest silence he'd given her all evening. It was 11 seconds. She counted every one. Yes, he said. She closed her eyes. Vincent, who had been with Lucienne for 9 years, who had been the first person from Lucienne's world that she'd ever met, before she'd understood fully what Lucienne's world was, who had stood at the back of their wedding in a gray suit and cried, actually cried, the brief controlled tears of a man who didn't cry often but couldn't prevent it that particular day, who had messaged tonight, Caruso is at the Harrington, 2nd floor, who had told them Caruso was there. He told you, she said, tonight. He told you where Caruso was. Yes. Why would he tell you if he was the source? Because someone who has been feeding intelligence to a rival for an unknown period of time, Lucian said very carefully, and who receives word that the rival has moved without warning in a direction that was not the plan, might choose to get ahead of it, might choose to be the one who sounds the alarm. Because the alarm is also information. It tells you how the person reacts when the plan goes sideways. She processed this. He warned you to see what you'd do, she said. Or he warned me because he's not the source and I'm wrong, Lucian said. That is also possible. That is why I have not moved yet. Who is the second person, she said. The second one who knows about Rotterdam. Dario, he said. Dario, who had stood in the corner of the ballroom with a small notebook and written down 9 names with the systematic patience of a man doing his job. Dario, who had been with Lucian for 11 years and who had, by the accounting of the people who kept such accounts, been the most consistently reliable person in that entire circle. Dario, who had been physically present at the reunion all evening and had therefore had the proximity to send a text from a burner bought 3 days ago and had therefore, she stopped herself. She stopped because she was not Lucian. She did not think this way professionally. She thought clearly, but not in this particular architecture. You're going to meet Caruso, she said. Yes. Before 2. Yes. And you're going to let him demonstrate his value, she said. You're going to sit across from him and listen and let him think the repositioning worked. A pause. Why do you say that? Because he knows about Rotterdam and the Ferreira arrangement and the federal contact, she said. And that information didn't come from a terminal access. That information came from someone who has been in rooms where those things were discussed. And you need to know how far it goes before you close the door. She paused. You can't close the door until you know how far it goes. The silence on the line was different this time. She recognized it. It was the silence he used when she'd said something he'd already concluded and was absorbing the fact of her arriving at the same place. Go back to the hotel, she said. Meet him. And while you're doing that, she looked at her phone, at the unknown number that had texted her, at the sequence of calls and texts and movements that had assembled themselves into this evening. Send me Dario. Nia, send me Dario, she said again. He made a list tonight, 9 names. I want to look at that list. That list is my reunion, she said. My classmates. Send me Dario. Another long pause. He'll be there in 8 minutes, Lucian said. The call ended. She sat in the concrete gray of the parking structure and looked at the ring on her hand and felt the shape of the evening she was actually in. Not the reunion, not the old cruelties, not the microphone in Courtney's voice, and the 10 years of avoidance that had led her here. The evening she was actually in was something else entirely, and it had a different set of requirements from her. She thought about the message. You should have stayed home. And she thought about the fact that the message had arrived 2 minutes after she got into the car. And she thought about the fact that the only people who had known she was in that specific car at that specific moment were the people who had been in the hotel lobby when she walked out. The bodyguards. Marco. And the people who'd been watching the lobby. And Dario, who had been coming from the ballroom and would have seen the convoy arrangement, would have known which car she'd been put in, had the physical access and the operational knowledge, and the specific contextual presence to have sent 4 words from a burner phone with his left hand, while his right hand put a small folded piece of paper into his jacket pocket. She was not Lucy Yen. She did not think this way professionally, but she was a woman who had spent 20 years learning to read rooms, learning to understand the difference between what people showed and what they were, learning to trust the intelligence that lived in the body rather than the more comfortable conclusions of the mind. Her body was very certain about something right now. She was working on being as certain as her body. Dario appeared at the entrance to level 3 7 minutes and 40 seconds after the call ended. He came from the stairwell, not the elevator, which was a choice that was either habitual caution or deliberate approach, and she couldn't tell which. He moved across the concrete floor toward the car with his jacket buttoned and his hands visible and his face wearing its professional neutrality. Marco's hand went back under his jacket. Dario stopped 6 feet from the car. He looked at the window. He couldn't see through it. The tinting was complete, but he looked at it with the attentiveness of someone who understood that what he couldn't see could still see him. Nia opened the door and stepped out. The air in the parking structure was cold and smelled of concrete dust and exhaust. Her feet were in her heels again, She'd put them back on before stepping out, because she was not going to have this conversation in her bare feet. She stood in the fluorescent light and looked at Dario across 6 feet of concrete, and she said, "Show me the list." Dario looked at her for a moment. His face was, as always, carefully uninformative. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced the folded piece of paper and held it out. She crossed the 6 feet between them and took it. She unfolded it. 9 names, written in a small, precise hand, numbered sequentially. She read them in order. She read them twice. She looked up at Dario. "Jennifer Holt," she said. "Number 7 on the list. How long has she been on Caruso's payroll?" Dario's face did something. It was a very small something, a barely perceptible shift in the quality of his stillness. But she caught it, because she had spent the last hour developing a very specific attentiveness to Dario's face. "I don't know what you're—" he began. "Jennifer Holt sat 3 rows behind me for 4 years, Nia said. She never said a word to my face, ever. In 4 years of sitting 3 rows behind me, she never once directed anything at me directly. Everything she said sideways, under her breath, to the person next to her." She paused. "Except tonight. Tonight she picked up her voice in a completely silent room full of people who'd just watched Lucien DeLuca walk through the door, and she said the most inflammatory thing she could have said, loudly enough for every person in the room to hear. Another pause. "Including Lucien." Dario's jaw had set. Slightly. But she saw it. Someone needed him angry, she said. Someone needed him to make a scene, or make a threat, or do something in a room full of witnesses that could be used. And when that didn't work, when Lucien held himself together, someone needed to know which car I was in and where I was going. She held the list up. "Jennifer Holt is number 7 on this list. You wrote this list. You put the names in order of public visibility. The people who were loudest, most prominent in what happened. Jennifer Holt was not the loudest. She was not the most prominent. She was a woman who muttered something in the middle of the room, and you put her at number 7. Tom. She looked at him. "Not 8, not 9, 7. Which means you were already thinking about her before you ordered the list by prominence." The parking structure was very quiet. Somewhere below them, a car engine turned over and moved toward the exit. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that was almost below hearing. Dario stood very still. "You've known her for a while," Nia said. "Jennifer Holt. You know her well enough to know that 7 is the right number for her. That she matters enough to be in the top half of the list, even though she wasn't in the top half of what happened tonight. Mrs. DeLuca." His voice was careful, calibrated. "I'm not accusing you of anything," she said. And she meant it. She was not Lucien. She did not have the architecture for accusations. "I'm asking you a question, and I'm asking you because in about 20 minutes my husband is going to sit across from Rafael Caruso and have a conversation that is going to determine a significant number of things. And he is going to walk into that conversation with incomplete information unless someone fills in the gap." She looked at him steadily. "Do you know Jennifer Holt?" The silence stretched to the point where it had its own weight, its own presence, something you could almost put your hand against. Dario looked at her. He looked at her with the expression of a man standing at a door that he had been keeping closed for a long time, feeling the particular exhaustion of the keeping. He opened his mouth, and behind him, from the stairwell, the door opened, and 2 men came through it, and neither of them was Vincent, and neither of them worked for Lucien DeLuca. Marco was out of the car before they cleared the door frame, his hand already up, already aimed, his voice sharp and carrying. "Don't!" The first man was already moving. He had the particular speed of someone who had been waiting on the other side of that door long enough to have his timing calibrated. And he covered the distance between himself and Marco in 2 seconds, with the efficiency of someone who did this as a profession. And Marco was good, but he was contained by the car door, and the angle was wrong, and the first man's elbow caught him across the face with enough force to drive him back into the car door with a sound that was both metallic and biological. Dario turned. Fast. Faster than Nia would have predicted. He turned and put himself between her and the 2 men without any visible decision. just the immediate physical fact of his body repositioning, and she understood in that instant, with the clarity that arrived when the body had to understand things faster than the mind, that whatever Dario was and whatever he knew about Jennifer Holt and whatever access terminal had been used 3 days ago, in this particular moment, in this parking structure, he was between her and the men coming through the door. The second man had something in his hand, not a gun, something smaller, something that caught the fluorescent light in a way that she registered as wrong before she fully processed what it was. Dario said very precisely, "Run." She ran. Not for the stairwell. The stairwell was where they'd come from. She ran deeper into the parking structure toward the far ramp, her heels hitting the concrete with the sound of something both urgent and absurd, the diamond ring on her finger throwing small cold points of light against the gray walls as she went. Her phone gripped in her hand. Lucien's number already pulled up. The call already connecting as she hit the ramp and went up, one more level. The sound of the struggle below her echoing off the concrete walls with the particular acoustics of a space that had been designed to carry sound but not to witness it. The call connected. Nia, his voice was already different. He had already heard something in the background before she spoke. "Parking structure," she said, and her breath was ragged from the run in the heels and the adrenaline moving through her system like something with edges. "2 men. Dario is, I don't know. Which level are you on?" 4, going to the roof. Going to the... "Stop on 4, he said. "Don't go to the roof. There's no exit on the roof. Find a pillar and put your back to it and don't move." She found a pillar. She put her back to it. The concrete was cold through the fabric of her dress, and she felt it against her shoulder blades with a vividness that was almost comforting, the realness of it, the solid and indifferent fact of concrete. She could hear something from the level below. She couldn't identify it. She held the phone to her ear and breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, the way she'd been breathing all evening, the way she'd taught herself to breathe in rooms that wanted to take that from her. "I'm on 4, she said. "Stay there," Lucien said, and she heard him moving, heard the sound of the bar on the second floor of the Harrington Grand receding as he stood from his chair, heard Caruso's voice saying something sharp in the background, heard Lucien say, without inflection and without particular volume, to someone who was not her, "We're done here." She pressed her back against the pillar and she held the phone, and she listened to him move through the hotel toward her, and the parking structure was very quiet now, the sounds from below having stopped, and she did not know what that meant, and she was making the decision not to know what it meant until she had more information. Her phone buzzed, a different notification. Not a call. A news alert that had pushed through from an app she'd forgotten she had. She almost dismissed it. Then she read the headline. "Breaking, Harrington Grand Hotel. Emergency services responding to incident on 2nd floor." She read it again. Then she understood that the conversation between Lucien and Caruso had not ended because Lucien had stood up from the table. It had ended before that. It had ended because something had happened in that bar before Lucien's phone rang, something that she had not been there to see, something that the headline was in the process of becoming specific about in a way that was going to change the shape of everything she thought she understood about this evening. She was still reading when the footsteps started on the ramp from level 3, coming up, and she pressed herself against the pillar, and she held completely still, and she waited to find out whose footsteps they were. The footsteps were Dario's. She knew them before she saw him. The particular weight distribution of them, slightly heavier on the left, a gait she had catalogued without meaning to over 3 years of watching him move through the peripheral spaces of her life. He came up the ramp from level 3 with his jacket torn at the shoulder seam and a cut above his left eyebrow that was producing blood in the slow, steady way of cuts in that specific location, the kind that looked worse than they were, and bled with complete indifference to whether you wanted them to stop. He was alone. She came out from behind the pillar, and he stopped when he saw her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the gray concrete floor of level 4 of the Callaway Street parking structure, and the fluorescent lights hummed and the city made its indifferent noise beyond the open walls, and neither of them said anything. Then she said, "The 2 men." "Gone," he said. His voice was steady, but she could hear the effort underneath it, the controlled breathing of someone managing pain. "Gone how?" "Gone as in no longer a problem for this evening." He pressed 2 fingers to the cut above his eyebrow with the unsentimental efficiency of someone taking inventory. The fingers came away red. He looked at them, then put them back. We should move. The police response on the second floor is going to generate activity in this structure within the next several minutes. Tell me about Jennifer Holt, she said. She said it without moving toward the ramp, without offering him anything that resembled an avenue of redirection. She had her back straight and her shoes on and her phone in her hand, and she was standing in the middle of a parking structure in a burgundy dress at 11:47 at night, and she was not moving until she had the answer to the question she'd been building toward for the last hour. Dario looked at her. The blood from his eyebrow had reached the outer corner of his eye, and he wiped it away with his jacket sleeve with a grimace that was the first unguarded expression she'd ever seen on his face. It made him look, for a brief and disorienting moment, like a person rather than a function. Jennifer Holt is my sister-in-law, he said. Was. My wife's younger sister. Nia held very still. Your wife, she said. Elena. He said the name with the specific flatness of a word that had been worn smooth by overuse, handled so many times that it had lost the texture of feeling and become something closer to a fact. She died 14 months ago, ovarian cancer, 7 months from diagnosis to... He stopped, pressed the jacket sleeve against his eyebrow again. 7 months. 14 months ago. She ran the number against what she knew. The federal case that had been building for 14 months. The intelligence that had been feeding to Caruso for an unknown period. The terminal access 3 days ago. Jennifer came to me after Elena died, Dario said. Jennifer had been sick herself. Different thing. Not terminal, but expensive. And she had debt. Medical debt. The kind that doesn't negotiate. He paused. Caruso found her 8 months ago. He approached her because she was connected to me, and because people in financial crisis make different decisions than people who are not. He offered to cover her debt, the entire amount, in exchange for information, Nia said. Introductions, he said. She didn't have information herself. She had access to me. Grief makes you... He stopped again. I was not careful. After Elena. I was not careful in the way that I am normally careful. I said things to Jennifer that I should not have said, in the way that people say things to family that they do not say to anyone else. A long pause. I said Lucien's name. I said it in context. I said it more than once. Nia breathed in through her nose slowly. She was feeding it to Caruso through Jennifer, she said. Jennifer to Caruso, not you. No, he said. Not me. And his voice on those 2 words had the weight of something that had been pressing on him for a long time. Not guilt exactly, because what he'd done was grieve without sufficient armor, which was not a crime, but the weight of consequence regardless. The weight of being the door through which the damage had entered. The terminal access 3 days ago, she said. The convoy schedule. I don't know who did that, he said. That was not me, and it was not Jennifer. She doesn't have access to anything internal, which means Caruso has another source, a smaller one. Someone with access to the scheduling system who is not significant enough to know about Rotterdam or the Ferreira arrangement, but who can read a calendar. And you told Lucien about Caruso at the hotel tonight because you'd found out what Jennifer had done, she said. I found out 6 days ago, he said. I've been trying to determine the extent of it before I... He stopped. I was going to tell him. I was building toward telling him. Tonight forced the timeline. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the cut above his eyebrow, and the torn jacket shoulder, and the controlled stillness of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for 6 days or 14 months, depending on how you measured the weight. The 2 men tonight, she said. Caruso sent them? No, Dario said. Caruso didn't want you touched. He was very specific about that. The 2 men tonight were sent by someone who does not want Caruso's negotiation to succeed, someone who benefits from the conflict continuing rather than resolving. He paused. There is a third party. There has been a third party from the beginning, and I have not been able to identify them. That is the part I could not bring to Lucien yet. I cannot bring him a problem I cannot name. Nia understood. She understood the architecture of it. The specific, exhausting architecture of a man who had spent 11 years earning a trust he could not afford to damage by bringing incomplete information to the person who depended on his information being complete. Her phone rang. Lucien. She answered it. I'm on level 4, she said immediately. Dario is with me. We're both fine. A pause of 3 seconds. Stay there, he said. I'm in the structure. He appeared from the ramp 2 minutes later, coming up from level 3 the same way Dario had, but without the torn jacket and without the blood. He came through the fluorescent light with his phone going back into his pocket, and his eyes moving first to her, then to Dario, then back to her, taking inventory in the order of his priorities. He crossed directly to her and put both hands on her face the way he had in the hotel corridor, checking her face with his eyes the way a person reads something important, looking for the thing between the lines. You're not hurt, he said. Not a question. A conclusion he was confirming. I'm not hurt, she said. He held her face for another moment. Then he lowered his hands and turned to Dario, and his face did the thing that she had learned to brace for, the settling into the bedrock expression, the one with no ceiling. Dario looked at him. He did not look away. Whatever Dario was, whatever he had and hadn't done, he was not a man who looked away from the consequences of his choices. And she found that she respected that, the way she respected any kind of courage that cost something. Tell me, Lucian said. Dario told him, all of it. Elena, Jennifer, Caruso, the 8 months of inadvertent exposure, the 6 days of knowing, the third party that had no name yet. He told it without embellishment and without mitigation and without the softening of sequence that people used when they were trying to manage how information landed. He told it straight through, and he held Lucian's gaze throughout, and when he finished, he said, I should have come to you sooner. I wanted the full picture first. That was a mistake in judgment, and I own it. The parking structure was quiet enough that the fluorescent hum was audible again. Lucian looked at Dario for a long time. Not with anger. She watched for anger, and it wasn't there. Or it wasn't the operative thing. What was there was something more complicated. The specific complication of a man absorbing a truth that had multiple valences simultaneously. The operational damage, the personal betrayal that wasn't quite betrayal. The grief that had caused it, and the cost that grief had generated. Lucien was not a simple man. Simple men responded to complex situations with simple emotions. He was looking at Dario with the full complexity of someone who understood that what had happened was not reducible to one thing. The scheduling terminal, he said finally, 3 days ago. Not me, Dario said. Not Jennifer, someone else. Vincent, Lucian said. Dario's silence was its own answer. Vincent, Lucian said again. Not a question this time. A landing. She watched something move across Lucien's face that she had never seen there before and would not see again. A brief, uncontrolled passage of something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived in the space where both of them had their roots. 9 years. Vincent had been with him for 9 years, had been at their wedding, had stood in the gray suit and let himself cry the brief, controlled tears of a man who didn't do it often. Why? Lucian said. Very quiet. I don't know, Dario said. Genuinely. I don't know Vincent's reasons. I know that the terminal access used his credentials. I know that the convoy schedule was the only thing accessed. And I know that he was the one who told you tonight about Caruso's location, which I have been turning over in my head for 2 hours and cannot make simple. It's not simple, Lucian said. No, Dario agreed. He told me because he needed to be ahead of it, Lucien said, and because he couldn't know whether Caruso was going to stay predictable. Caruso moving to the hotel without warning. That was a break from the plan. Vincent told me to re-establish control of the variable. A pause. Which means he and Caruso are not aligned, which means Vincent is the third party. The understanding of it moved through all three of them in the specific sequence of a truth that reorders everything it touches. Not Caruso's man, not Caruso's source. A separate actor entirely with a separate agenda, using Caruso's approach as cover for his own movement, feeding Caruso just enough information to make Caruso's play viable while positioning himself on the outside of the outcome, available to pick up whatever fell in the aftermath. He wants you removed, Nia said. Both men looked at her. Not by Caruso. Caruso wants a seat, not the table. Caruso wants to negotiate. But if Caruso's approach generates conflict, and the conflict escalates, and Lucien is exposed to a federal case that's been building for 14 months. She paused. Vincent doesn't have to do anything. He just has to be the last man standing in a clean position when everything else falls. Lucien looked at her with the expression she'd seen in the car earlier, the one that was the interior version of something, the precursor to a thing he didn't say out loud. He turned back to Dario. Where is he? He was at the Harrington when I left, Dario said. Lobby level. He was monitoring the situation. Call him, Lucien said. Tell him I need him here. Don't say anything else. Dario pulled out his phone. She put her hand on Lucien's arm. He looked at her. She said quietly, so only he could hear it. Whatever you're going to do, think about the federal case first. Think about what's already built. And think about the fact that 9 years is 9 years, even when it ends like this. He looked at her hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face. She held his gaze and did not add anything to what she'd said because she'd said exactly what she meant, and she trusted him to hear all of it. He covered her hand with his. One brief, complete pressure. Then he removed it gently and turned back to the ramp. Vincent arrived on level 4 11 minutes later, and he knew before he cleared the ramp. He knew because the body knew. In the way that bodies knew things that the mind had spent considerable effort organizing around, and the body's knowledge showed up first in the quality of his stillness at the top of the ramp. The particular stillness of something that has run out of forward momentum. He was 53 years old. His hair had gone fully gray in the last 2 years, which Nia had assumed was age and now understood was possibly something else. The gray that came from maintaining something that cost you constantly. He stood at the top of the ramp in his gray suit, and he looked at Lucien, and he did not run, and he did not speak, and he did not perform surprise. Lucien was standing 10 feet from the ramp with his hands in his pockets, and his expression on its bedrock setting. Okay, Vincent said. That was all. One word. The word of a man stepping into the weight of a thing he'd known was coming. Sit down, Lucien said. There was nowhere to sit. Vincent lowered himself to the concrete floor of the parking structure with the careful movement of a man with bad knees, and he sat there in his gray suit on the concrete with his back against the rear wheel of a parked car, and Lucien crouched in front of him, and the geometry of it was both strange and, Nia thought, exactly right, neither of them above the other, both of them on the same level of the same floor. Tell me why, Lucien said. Vincent looked at him. The gray suit had a small stain on the lapel that Nia noticed with the irrelevant clarity of a detail that the mind seized when it needed somewhere to put its eyes. The federal case, Vincent said. You built it, Lucien said. I provided information to a federal contact, Vincent said. For 8 months. Not everything. Not enough to close it. Enough to keep it open. Enough to keep it in place. He paused. As a contingency. A contingency for what? Lucien said. For the day this ended badly, Vincent said, and his voice was completely flat. For the day someone with more resources and less patience than Caruso decided to remove you in a way that wasn't negotiable. The federal case is leverage. It is the only kind of leverage that certain kinds of people respect, because it creates consequences in a system they can't touch. He looked at Lucien steadily. I built it as a shield, not a weapon. The silence stretched. Somewhere below, the sound of vehicles in the structure's lower levels, the ordinary movement of people with ordinary evenings going home. You used my wife to position it, Lucien said. I used the convoy schedule, Vincent said. I put you at the hotel on the same night as Caruso because I needed Caruso to make his approach in a location where the outcome would be visible, where it could be documented, where it would establish on record that Caruso initiated contact. A pause. I did not know what would happen on the second floor tonight. What happened on the second floor? Nia said. Both men looked at her. She'd been standing back far enough to be almost outside the circle of the conversation, but she had heard every word and she was not willing to hold the question anymore. Vincent looked at her with an expression that contained more than she'd expected from him, more complexity, more of the thing underneath the professional surface. Caruso had a medical event, he said, cardiac, in the bar. The emergency services response was for him. A pause. He is alive. He was alert when they took him out. Another pause. He will not be pursuing the negotiation from a hospital bed, and when he recovers, he will understand that the evening did not go as planned and that the information he was offering has now been compromised, because the existence of the Rotterdam accounts and the Ferreira arrangement and the federal contact has been stated out loud in a room with at least 3 people who didn't know all of it before tonight. You were in the bar, Lucian said. It wasn't a question. I was in the bar, Vincent said. I was watching. You let it proceed. I let Caruso make his offer, Vincent said, because I needed it on record that the offer was made, and because I needed to know how much he actually had. A pause. He had more than I expected, which means my source, my federal contact, has been sharing information in both directions, which means the case I built as a shield has been turned into something else without my knowledge. Someone is running you, Lucian said. Someone has been supplementing my contact's income, Vincent said, with the flat precision of a man who had arrived at a conclusion that cost him something to state. I don't know who yet. I have been trying to find out for 6 weeks. The parking structure hummed. Nia looked at Vincent on the concrete floor in his gray suit, and she thought about the wedding. The gray suit. A different gray suit, but the same man. The brief, controlled tears of someone who was, under everything, loyal. But loyal to a version of a future he'd constructed himself, without telling anyone. The specific arrogance of a man who believed his reasons were good enough to exempt him from the requirement of honesty. You should have told me, Lucien said. Yes, Vincent said. No qualification, no defense. I should have told you. 8 months ago, you should have told me. Yes. When you went to the federal contact. Yes. The yes accumulated, each one exact and undefended and increasingly costly. She could see it costing him. She could see the specific expenditure of each admission in the set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands, the quality of his eyes staying on Lucien's face through each one. Lucien stood up. He straightened to his full height, and he looked down at Vincent on the concrete floor for a long moment, and she watched him make a decision. She watched it move through his face in the order in which he processed things. The operational first, the personal second, the resolution third. She had seen him make decisions before. She had never seen one that looked quite like this one. He reached down. He offered his hand. Vincent looked at it for a moment, then took it, and Lucien pulled him to his feet. You're done, Lucien said. Not tonight, not in the middle of this, but when this is resolved, you're done. He held Vincent's gaze. And you're going to help me resolve it. You're going to bring me everything you have on the federal contact and whoever has been supplementing him. And you're going to help me build a counter to the case you built. And you're going to do it thoroughly and completely and without any further independent decisions. He paused. After that, you leave. Clean. With what you've earned over 9 years. And we don't have this conversation again. Vincent held his gaze. He looked like a man absorbing both the penalty and the mercy simultaneously, trying to find the right response to something that was both. Agreed, he said. Dario, Lucian said without looking away from Vincent. Yes, Dario said. You'll work with him on the counter case, both of you, whatever you need. He looked at Dario now. And you'll come to me when you have something, instead of when you have everything. Dario nodded once. It was not a small nod. It carried the weight of a man who had been given back something he wasn't certain he still deserved. Lucien turned to Nia. She looked at him across the concrete floor in the fluorescent light, and she felt the composite weight of the entire evening. Every layer of it, the ballroom and the microphone and the ring going back onto her finger and the car and the text message and the parking structure and the footsteps on the ramp and Dario's torn jacket and Vincent's gray suit on the concrete, all of it present simultaneously. None of it resolved in the way she'd expected any of it to be when she'd opened that cream-colored envelope on a Tuesday morning in her kitchen. She had come to the reunion to prove something to herself. To stand in the room that had broken her at 14 and demonstrate to herself that it no longer had the power to do that. And it had had the power to do it. Courtney's voice through the microphone had reached inside her with an accuracy that 10 years had not diminished. And she had sat very still and kept her chin level and felt it reaching her and refused to show that it was reaching her. And the refusal had cost her something. She was done refusing things at a cost. She crossed the floor to Lucien, and she stopped in front of him, and she said, I want to go home. Yes, he said. And I want to tell you something in the car. Okay, he said. And tomorrow, she said, I want you to handle all of this without telling me the parts that I don't need to know. Because you know which parts those are, and so do I. And I married into this life with open eyes, And I'm not asking you to protect me from it. I'm asking you to let me decide which parts of it live in our kitchen and which parts don't. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time with that expression she'd learned to read, the interior version of something he almost never said out loud. "What do you want to tell me in the car?" he said. "That I'm glad I went tonight," she said. "Even with all of it, I'm glad I went." He looked at her for another moment. Then he reached up and touched her face, just the back of his fingers against her cheek, brief and deliberate, the gesture of a man expressing something in the only private language he was fully fluent in. They left the parking structure in the order of operational priority. Dario first, then Vincent, then Marco, who had a bruised jaw and a cut lip, and the expression of a man who was declining to make an event of either. Lucien and Nia last, coming down through the levels in the concrete and fluorescent quiet, their footsteps mixing on the ramp. In the car, she didn't talk for a few minutes. She let the city move past the windows, and she sat with the ring on her finger and the weight of the evening on her, and she let herself simply exist in the particular relief of a thing being over. Then she said, "Tyler Boone embezzled the alumni fund." "Yes," Lucien said, "and Courtney's boutique has been underreporting revenue for 31 months. He looked at her. "How do you know about Courtney?" "I don't know how I know," she said, which was partly true. "I know the way I know things. What are you going to do about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes. Nothing dramatic," he said. "The appropriate people will receive information they should already have, through channels that have nothing to do with tonight." He paused. "Marcus Webb's deal has already been put on hold, which I'm told will resolve itself into a permanent hold when certain due diligence produces certain findings." Another pause. "The influencer who fabricated the charitable contributions has been a known quantity for some time. A journalist with an interest in that story will find their sourcing improved considerably this week." She looked at him. "You started this before tonight," she said. "I started some of it before tonight," he said. "When you told me you were going to the reunion, I made some inquiries." He said it without apology and without any particular weight, as if it were the most obvious thing. "They are your classmates. I wanted to know who they were." "And what you found?" "What I found suggested that the passage of time had not improved several of them significantly," he said, "and that the mechanisms of consequence that they had avoided in the ordinary course of things could be introduced without any particular effort on my part." She looked out the window at the city. "You were planning this before you walked through the door," she said. "I was prepared," he said, "in the event that preparation was warranted." "It was warranted." "Yes," he said, "it was." She let that sit. She let the full understanding of the evening settle into its final shape. Her husband, who had waited outside for 47 minutes and then walked through the doors when he could no longer not walk through them, who had knelt beside her chair and put a ring on her finger and asked one question with the certainty of a man for whom the answer would determine the evening's temperature, who had then managed a meeting with a rival on the second floor of the same hotel while simultaneously tracking her car through the city, who had arrived in a parking structure and crouched on concrete in an expensive suit to hear the truth from a man he'd trusted for 9 years, who had offered that man his hand at the end of it. He had been carrying all of this simultaneously, and none of it had shown on his face in the ballroom when he knelt beside her. Nothing had shown except the thing he'd come to show, which was the specific, undiluted fact of how much she was worth to him. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had established this thoroughly over the course of the evening, but she felt something in her chest that was the structural cousin of crying. The thing that happened when a feeling was too large for the architecture that usually contained it and needed to go somewhere. She took Lucien's hand. She just held it. She looked out the window and she held his hand and she felt the ring against her finger and the warmth of his palm, and she said nothing. He turned his hand and held hers back. That was all. He didn't speak, and he didn't look at her, and he didn't perform anything. He just held her hand in the dark of the moving car, while the city slid past the windows in its ordinary and indifferent beauty. The brownstone appeared after 20 minutes, the familiar facade, the climbing jasmine invisible in the dark, but present in the faint, complicated sweetness that reached her when the car door opened. She stepped out onto the sidewalk and stood for a moment in the nighttime air, her shoes in her hand, the concrete warm under her bare feet from a day that had been hot before it became this. She looked up. The sky above the city was a dark orange-gray, The kind of sky that cities made of their own ambient light, no stars visible, but the dark itself luminous with accumulated human brightness. She stood in it for a moment and breathed it in. Lucienne came around the car and stood beside her, looking at the same sky. She thought about this cream envelope on a Tuesday. She thought about the gold italic script. Nia Brooks. The name she'd carried for 20 years before she added the other one, before she'd stood in a room with this man and become something that was both names simultaneously. She thought about Courtney Marsh's voice through the microphone, the precise calculation of it, and she thought about the way she'd sat in that ballroom and kept her chin level and felt the room trying to do its old damage and refused to let it show. She thought about what it had cost her, that refusal, and she thought about the fact that the cost was worth it. Not because it had proved something to the room, but because she had paid it for herself. Because the refusal had been hers and nobody else's, and she had produced it from somewhere inside her that Courtney Marsh in 10 years of distance and one terrible evening had not managed to reach. She was Nia Brooks DeLuca, and she was 34 years old, and she had built a life out of the wreckage of feeling unworthy of one. And the life was real. The jasmine and the brownstone and the man standing beside her and the ring on her finger and all of it real. And it had been real before anyone in that ballroom saw it. And it remained real now that they had. And the realness of it had never been there to confer and was never there to take. "Come inside," Lucienne said quietly. "In a minute," she said. He nodded. He went to the door and he opened it and he waited, not pushing, not pressing, just standing in the open doorway with the interior light behind him, available. She stood on the sidewalk in her bare feet with the jasmine in the air and the amber city sky above her, and she let herself have the minute. She let herself stand in the full weight of everything the evening had been. The worst of it, the microphone and the laughter and the cold in the car when she understood what she'd walked into, and the best of it, his hands on her face in the parking structure corridor, and the strange, uneven, very human fact of a day that had contained both. She thought about Jennifer Holt on the floor of a bathroom stall, trying to remember what she'd said. She thought about Tyler Boone and his wobbling plates, and Marcus Webb with his face-down phone. She thought about Courtney Marsh standing beside the stage, the warmth extinguished, looking at Nia's ring with an expression that Nia understood now, with the benefit of distance, had not been about the ring at all. Had been about whatever Courtney had been told, for 20 years, that love looked like, and whether she had it. And the specific, unplanned confrontation of watching it looked like something different than she'd been sold. She did not feel sorry for Courtney. She did not feel sorry for any of them. But she noticed that she did not feel triumphant either, and she spent a moment with the absence of triumph and found that she was glad it was absent. The satisfaction she felt was quieter than triumph, less aggressive, less contingent on their suffering. It was the satisfaction of having walked into a room that had once made her want to disappear, and having left it still entirely herself. That was enough. She was done with the arithmetic of whether things were enough. They were. She turned and walked up the steps to the open door, and the light and the man standing in it, and she went inside. In the kitchen, she put her shoes by the door and her clutch on the counter, and she stood in the familiar geography of her own home with the jasmine scent now gone, replaced by the smell of coffee and wood and the particular quiet of a house that had been waiting for her. Lucien had taken off his jacket. He was standing by the counter with his sleeves rolled up, and he was making coffee. And the absolute domesticity of it, the specific, improbable domesticity of this man in this kitchen making coffee at midnight after the evening they'd had, hit her somewhere between the throat and the chest. She watched him. He moved through the kitchen with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, unhurried, deliberate, each motion exact. He knew where everything was. He'd learned where everything was in the same way he'd learned everything about her, not because she'd instructed him, but because he paid attention and never stopped. He turned and saw her watching, and he held her gaze for a moment without speaking. "I'm not going to any more reunions," she said. Something moved in his expression, the precursor to the smile. "Noted. I mean it. I believe you. And the next time you run background checks on my former classmates before a social event," she said, "I want to know about it in advance." He was quiet for a beat. "That might limit the effectiveness of the Lucienne. I'll tell you in advance," he said. She crossed the kitchen and she went to him and she put her arms around him and she pressed her face against his chest and she felt his arms come around her immediately. No hesitation, no readjustment, just his arms around her with the certainty of two people who had learned each other's dimensions completely. She felt his chin come to rest on top of her head. She felt the steady rhythm of him, his heartbeat, the breath moving in and out of his chest, the warmth of him, the realness. She stood there. She let herself stand there in the kitchen with the coffee brewing and the jasmine outside and the city beyond the windows going about its ordinary midnight business. And she held on and she let herself be held, and she did not manage her face or her breathing or the thing happening in her chest, because there was no one watching and she was home and she was done performing. After a while he said very quietly, "I'm sorry about tonight." She turned her face against his chest. "Which part?" "The parts I could have prevented," he said. "The parts I should have seen coming." She thought about this. She thought about the cream envelope and the gold italic script and the 47 minutes and the ring going back onto her finger and the parking structure and his hand covering hers in the dark of the moving car. "You came," she said. "When it mattered. You came." He tightened his arms around her briefly, and she felt it as a word in the language they'd built together, the only response to the only thing that needed saying. Outside, the jasmine grew in the dark against the wall of the brownstone, invisible and present and sweetly persistent, the way certain things persisted. Not because the world made room for them, but because they had put their roots down deep enough in the right soil and held on through every kind of weather until holding on was simply what they did. Inside, the coffee finished brewing, and Nia Brooks DeLuca held on to her husband in her own kitchen in the middle of the night, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she knew it. And that knowing was the whole of it, simple and hard-won and entirely hers.